The relationship between Lisa Whitmore and Jalen, a black Navy SEAL, grew increasingly tense after a heated argument that escalated beyond words. It all started when Lisa, in a moment of frustration, insulted Jalen during a heated conversation. Jalen, normally calm and collected, was visibly angered by her words, but the real shock came when her husband, Brad, stepped in. Instead of calming things down, Brad aggressively confronted Jalen, sparking a physical altercation. The tension was palpable, and the once peaceful atmosphere between the three quickly turned into hostility. What none of them realized at that moment was that Jalen was not just a simple soldier. The truth about his identity was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just an enlisted Navy SEAL, he was actually a covert operative sent on a top-secret mission to gather intelligence on Lisa and Brad. The twist came when Jalen revealed that his mission was not to fight in a war but to investigate something much more personal. Jalen was the son of a legendary soldier, and his family had been affected by a scandal that involved Lisa and Brad. In the past, Lisa had unknowingly become entangled in an international military case that had far-reaching consequences, and Jalen had been assigned to track her and her husband's every move. The discovery shook Lisa to her core. She had no idea that her seemingly insignificant actions years ago had set off a chain of events that led to her current predicament. As Jalen's mission came to light, the emotional turmoil for Lisa and Brad grew unbearable. The weight of betrayal, the realization that they were being watched, and the guilt of unknowingly contributing to a larger, more dangerous situation consumed them. Lisa, once confident in her life and choices, now found herself questioning everything. Brad, in his pride and arrogance, continued to lash out at Jalen, refusing to acknowledge the magnitude of their situation. But as Jalen laid bare the truth, it became impossible for Brad to deny the severity of their actions. The atmosphere became thick with tension and regret. Lisa and Brad, in their desperation, tried to deny their involvement, but Jalen, undeterred and resolute, held firm. His professional demeanor never wavered, but beneath the surface, it was clear that the weight of the mission had taken a personal toll on him as well. He wasn't just doing his duty, he was avenging the legacy of his family, seeking justice for the wrongs done to them. In the end, the consequences of the past were unavoidable. Lisa and Brad's once stable life crumbled, their careers destroyed by the revelations. They were arrested, and their reputations were shattered. Jalen, however, emerged victorious. His mission was complete, and though he was emotionally scarred by the journey, he had achieved his objective. His actions were heroic, but the path to justice had been a painful one, as he had to confront the very people he once thought he could trust. The story ended with a sobering reminder that sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you, and the truth can be more devastating than any lie. The revelation of Jalen's true identity shattered the fragile sense of security that Lisa and Brad had built around their lives. At first, Jalen had appeared to be nothing more than a quiet, professional Navy SEAL, a man who carried the weight of his duty with a calm demeanor. His interactions with the couple were curt but respectful, as if he were a mere observer in their world, quietly standing on the periphery. Lisa and Brad had never given him much thought, he was just another soldier carrying out his assignment. However, as the tension between them grew, the calm surface of their relationship began to crack, revealing something far more dangerous beneath. The first crack in the facade came during a particularly heated argument between the couple and Jalen. Brad, frustrated by the mounting pressure and the growing distance between them, snapped at Jalen, accusing him of overstepping his boundaries. But Jalen's response was anything but what they expected. He didn't retaliate with anger or a defensive stance. Instead, his demeanor shifted. The calm mask he had worn for so long slipped away, and in its place, a cold, emotionless man stood before them. Then came the revelation: Jalen wasn't just a soldier on a routine assignment. He wasn't simply there because of his military rank. His presence had been part of a much deeper, much more personal mission. His calmness had never been about professionalism, it had been about control. Jalen's true purpose for infiltrating their lives was far more intimate than either Lisa or Brad could have imagined. With a voice that barely trembled, Jalen finally let them in on the truth: his mission had nothing to do with surveillance or military objectives. It was about vengeance. Jalen had come to destroy them, not because of what they did now, but because of something from their past. His father, a respected and decorated soldier, had been falsely accused of a heinous crime, one that destroyed his reputation and shattered his life. The scandal, which had reverberated across military circles, had been linked to an incident that involved Lisa, a moment in time she could barely remember. But for Jalen, that incident had ruined everything. Jalen's father had been the fall guy for a scheme in which Lisa and Brad had unknowingly played a part. The crime was orchestrated to hide larger, more sinister dealings, and Lisa's involvement, though unintended, had been the key to his father's downfall. Jalen's rage had burned quietly for years, growing into something that demanded retribution. He had spent countless hours meticulously planning, learning everything he could about Lisa and Brad, and following their every move. It wasn't just a mission for him, it was personal. For years, Jalen had been playing a dangerous game, blending into their lives, watching them from the shadows. He never intended to confront them until he had gathered enough information to expose them for what they were. What hurt him the most wasn't just the betrayal of his father's reputation, but the realization that Lisa and Brad, the people he had been watching all this time, had no idea how deeply their actions had impacted his family. The pain of watching them live their lives without the faintest clue about the damage they had caused had eaten away at him. Lisa, when confronted with the truth, could barely comprehend the scale of Jalen's revelation. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together a history she had long forgotten. The memory of the scandal was buried deep, a blur of names and faces she couldn't place. She had never meant to harm anyone, and yet here was a man standing before her, telling her that her actions, though she had no memory of them, had ruined his entire life. The weight of Jalen's words hit her like a slap to the face, the realization dawning on her that the world she had tried so hard to protect was built on lies and hidden truths. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, and for a moment, she felt paralyzed, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Brad, ever the protective husband, was the first to lash out. His pride took over, and he tried to deny the accusations, even going as far as to accuse Jalen of fabricating the entire story. The truth was too painful for him to accept. He couldn't bear the thought that his wife, whom he had married, whom he had built a life with, could be responsible for destroying a family. His anger flared, his voice rising, accusing Jalen of manipulating the situation. But even as he shouted, there was a gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. The details Jalen provided were too precise, too accurate for them to be fabrications. The emotional toll on Jalen was not lost on him either. His mission, which had started as a quest for justice, had evolved into something more complicated. The need for revenge had been replaced with something far more bitter, the understanding that no matter what happened, no one would walk away from this unscathed. Jalen's heart had hardened over the years, but as he stood there, confronting the couple who had unknowingly caused his family's ruin, he felt the weight of his own choices. Was the destruction of their lives worth the years of pain and heartache he had endured? His father's name had been tarnished, but in trying to avenge him, Jalen had become something he never wanted to be, a man consumed by vengeance, unable to see beyond the pain of the past. As Lisa and Brad's world began to crumble, Jalen realized that the quest for justice had come at too great a cost. The truth, once revealed, was no longer just a tool for vengeance, it was a mirror reflecting the damage done on all sides. Jalen's identity as a soldier, a man on a mission, was no longer clear. The lines between right and wrong, justice and revenge, had blurred, and in the end, none of them could escape the consequences of their actions. The past had caught up to them in the most unforgiving of ways, and no one could walk away unchanged. Jalen's past was a series of jagged memories that cut deep into the very core of who he was. Every event, every betrayal, every unjust moment, had shaped him into the man he had become. But what truly defined him was the heavy weight of a single day, a day that altered the course of his entire life and left an indelible scar on his soul. He was not just a man driven by vengeance. He was a man seeking to restore what was stolen from him, even if it meant sacrificing his own humanity in the process. Growing up, Jalen had always seen his father as a hero. His father, a decorated military officer, was everything Jalin aspired to be: strong, disciplined, honorable. The two shared a bond that felt unbreakable. His father taught him to value loyalty, duty, and courage above all else. Jalin had admired him deeply, even looked up to him as the epitome of everything right and good in the world. The world of order, structure, and justice was his father's world, and by extension, it had become Jalin's too. But that world came crashing down with a single phone call, a phone call that turned his entire life upside down. It was a quiet afternoon when Jalin's father was accused of a crime he did not commit. The accusation came out of nowhere, like a storm on the horizon, and in a flash, everything they had worked for was destroyed. A military operation had gone awry, an error that spiraled into something much worse. The details of the operation weren't clear to Jalin at first, but as the accusations grew louder, he quickly learned the truth: his father was being used as a scapegoat in a larger scheme. Powerful figures in the government had orchestrated a cover-up, and his father had unwittingly been caught in the middle. The betrayal was not just a simple mistake, it was a calculated move that sought to destroy his family. His father's once proud reputation was torn apart in front of his eyes. Jalin had seen the look in his father's eyes, eyes that once held a quiet strength, now clouded with confusion and defeat. The proud military officer was reduced to a man on trial, stripped of everything he had worked so hard for. He was dishonored, dismissed from the service, and abandoned by those who had once respected him. To Jalin, this was more than just an injustice, it was a personal assault on everything he had ever believed in. As a teenager, Jalin was helpless to stop it. The world had become a darker place, one where power and corruption triumphed over truth and justice. He couldn't understand why the system that had once seemed so fair, so unyielding, would betray his father in such a way. The confusion soon turned to anger, and that anger festered, gnawing at him every waking moment. He became consumed by a desire to right the wrongs done to his father, to expose the people behind the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives. The need for justice burned in him, a fire that could not be extinguished. Jalin's anger transformed him. He joined the military, not just as a way to honor his father's legacy, but with a singular, all-consuming goal: revenge. He wanted to bring down those who had done this to his father, to see them exposed for the corrupt individuals they were. But as he rose through the ranks, trained to be an elite soldier, his obsession grew. It wasn't enough to simply defeat the people responsible for his father's downfall. He needed to make them understand the pain they had caused him, to make them feel the loss, the humiliation, the despair that had become his constant companions. The military molded him into a weapon, someone who could navigate any situation, someone who could blend in, unnoticed, and take down the enemy from within. He became a master of deception, a man who wore the mask of a soldier while hiding the darkness that lurked beneath. He grew more distant, more controlled, and more dangerous. The man who had once been driven by a sense of honor and duty was now consumed by a single, dark purpose. Years passed, and Jalin methodically tracked down every lead, every scrap of information that could bring him closer to the truth. Lisa, a name that had once meant nothing to him, became a key figure in his investigation. As he dug deeper, he discovered that Lisa was unknowingly connected to the conspiracy that had ruined his father's life. She had been a part of the chain of events that led to his father's disgrace, though she had no idea. The realization hit him hard. He had spent years building a narrative in his mind, one where the people responsible were monsters who knew exactly what they were doing. But now, he saw something different. Lisa wasn't a villain. She was a pawn in a much larger game. And yet, the anger did not subside. It twisted within him, making him question everything he had become. Jalin could have walked away, could have forgiven her ignorance. But he couldn't. The memory of his father's shattered spirit, the look of a man broken by the weight of betrayal, drove him forward. He couldn't let it go. The past had shaped him, and now, it controlled him. Jalin infiltrated Lisa's life with the precision of a trained soldier, blending in seamlessly, observing her every move. He had become an expert at hiding his true intentions, wearing the mask of a friend, a confidant, while all the while his mind was focused on one thing: revenge. He watched as Lisa and Brad went about their lives, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. He saw their flaws, their mistakes, and for the first time in years, he began to question if they truly deserved the punishment he had planned for them. But every time he looked back at his father's ruined life, every time he remembered the humiliation and pain, his resolve hardened again. Jalon had become a man lost to his past, a man whose desire for revenge had replaced any sense of morality or compassion. He had isolated himself, distanced himself from the very thing that had once driven him, his father's legacy of honor and duty. Now, all that mattered was getting even. His mind, once filled with hope for justice, was now clouded by the darkness of his own anger. The past had become his prison, and he couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the people he was hunting anymore. It was himself. Jalon was a man at war with his own soul, and the line between right and wrong was no longer clear. His father's betrayal had created a monster within him, a monster he could no longer control. And as the days passed, and his plan to take down Lisa and Brad moved closer to fruition, Jalon realized that the revenge he had long sought might come at a price he wasn't willing to pay. Betrayal is a poison that seeps into the heart, eroding the foundation of trust, and twisting every emotion until they become unrecognizable. For Jalon, the weight of betrayal was not just a fleeting pain, it was a shadow that loomed over him, influencing every decision he made, every relationship he formed, and every ounce of his being. The betrayal he experienced, especially early on in his life, had a lasting impact that could never be undone, and it was this deep wound that shaped the person he would ultimately become. The first betrayal came from someone who should have been his protector, his father. Jalon had grown up idolizing the man who was not only a father but a hero in his eyes. His father was a strong, dignified man, deeply committed to his values, his family, and his country. Jalon watched as his father's reputation was shattered in the blink of an eye, dragged through the mud by accusations that were not only false but also part of a larger scheme of political maneuvering. He had always believed in the goodness of the world, but that belief came crashing down when he saw how easily his father, the man who had always stood for justice, had been torn apart by the very system he had devoted his life to serving. The betrayal wasn't just in the lies told about his father, it was in the cold, heartless way in which the world turned its back on them. The justice system that had once been a symbol of truth had failed them. The very institutions that were meant to protect the innocent had discarded his father, sacrificing him for their own gain. Jalon's world shattered, and with it, his trust in the system, in people, and in the ideals he had always held dear. The anger, frustration, and disbelief he felt were overwhelming, but it was the sense of abandonment that truly ate at him. His father was an innocent man, yet no one cared to fight for him. Jalon realized then that the world he had once believed in was nothing but a facade. In the aftermath of this betrayal, Jalon found himself consumed by a deep, burning anger. The loss of his father's reputation, his family's dignity, and his own sense of security was too much for him to bear. Every corner he turned, every person he encountered, seemed to remind him of the lies that had been told, and the injustice that had been done. Jalon couldn't simply accept this. He couldn't move on, not when the people who had wronged his family walked free, oblivious to the pain they had caused. The betrayal gnawed at him, pushing him to a breaking point where revenge seemed the only way to right the wrongs of the past. This hunger for revenge slowly became an obsession. What started as a desire to seek justice for his father morphed into something darker. Jalon's moral compass began to fray, and the lines between right and wrong became blurred. He knew that taking revenge would require him to sacrifice something, perhaps even his own soul, but in the depth of his pain, he no longer cared. He couldn't afford to be the same person he was before. He couldn't afford to let the betrayal go unanswered. Over time, his quest for retribution led him down a path that he had never imagined. He infiltrated the lives of those who had been complicit in the conspiracy to ruin his father, people who, like Lisa, were entangled in a web of deceit and lies. Each new discovery only deepened his sense of betrayal. Everyone seemed to be hiding something, and the more he uncovered, the more he realized how deeply rooted the lies were. It was as though betrayal had become a pervasive force that had touched every part of his life. Jalon became consumed by this realization, no longer trusting anyone or anything. His feelings of anger transformed into paranoia, and with each step he took towards uncovering the truth, his humanity seemed to slip further away. He found himself questioning everything, the people he had once loved, the values he had once held dear, and even the very idea of justice. The more Jalan focused on his goal, the more disconnected he became from the person he had once been. The betrayal that had started with his father's fall from grace now seemed to define him, to be the very thing that gave his life meaning. His relationships with others became increasingly strained as his obsession with vengeance consumed him. He pushed people away, unwilling to let anyone get too close, because in his mind, betrayal lurked in every corner. He had no time for anything but his mission, to destroy those who had destroyed his family. Jalan's path was one of destruction, not just of the enemies who had wronged him, but of himself. The bitterness and hatred that had taken root in his soul were not something he could easily shed. They were a part of him now, shaping every thought and every action. He was no longer the idealistic young man who had believed in justice and fairness. He had become something darker, someone who viewed the world through the lens of betrayal, always looking for the next slight, the next lie, the next betrayal that would push him closer to his ultimate goal. As his journey continued, Jalan realized that the more he pursued revenge, the less he recognized the man he was becoming. He had been broken by betrayal in ways he could never have anticipated, and in his quest to seek justice, he had lost himself entirely. What started as a desire for truth and redemption had morphed into an all-consuming thirst for vengeance. Jalan was no longer sure if he was fighting for justice or if he had simply become a puppet of the anger and pain that had once been his life's guiding force. The betrayal had not only shaped his past, it had become the force that governed his every move, and in the end, it was unclear if he would ever be able to find his way back. Jalan's journey, which had once been driven by an all-consuming thirst for vengeance, had led him to the precipice of a realization that tore through him like a wave crashing onto jagged rocks. It had been years of carefully calculated steps, each move, each decision fueled by an intense hatred for those who had betrayed him and stolen everything he held dear. He had woven himself into a web of deceit, surrounded by lies, manipulation, and dark promises. But now, as he faced the very individuals responsible for the pain he had endured, something within him began to crack. His fingers trembled as he reached out, slowly but deliberately, touching the cold, smooth surface of the weapon he had so carefully prepared for this moment. He had pictured this day for years, replaying the scene over and over in his mind, the satisfaction of seeing his enemies on their knees, begging for mercy. It was supposed to be the culmination of all his suffering, a moment where he would rise above the wreckage of his past and show the world that no one could break him. He had believed that this moment of revenge would bring him peace. But now, as he stood there, staring at the faces of those who had caused his father's downfall and his own slow unraveling, he felt no relief. The anger he had spent so many years nurturing felt like a distant echo, a fleeting sensation that no longer had any real power over him. It was as if, with each breath he took, the weight of the years of hatred that had carried him forward was lifting, leaving him feeling empty, hollow, and lost. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time, he realized how little satisfaction there was in seeing his enemies trapped, their faces twisted in fear and regret. He had imagined this moment would feel like a grand victory, a triumphant declaration that he had overcome his pain. But now, standing before them, he felt as though he were staring at ghosts, faint, translucent, unimportant. The satisfaction he had once expected was nowhere to be found. There was no joy in seeing them suffer. All he could see now were the echoes of his own darkness reflected in their eyes. Jalan's heart pounded painfully in his chest, and for a brief moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of the realization that consumed him. Had he truly become the thing he had set out to destroy? He had once believed that by eliminating those who had wronged him, he would restore the balance of justice in his life. But as he stared at the broken faces of the people before him, he couldn't deny that he had lost something far more precious than he had ever imagined, himself. The path he had walked had led him to a place of no return. The lines between right and wrong had become so blurred, so indistinct, that he could no longer tell where his sense of justice had ended and his thirst for vengeance had begun. The man who had once believed in honor, in fighting for what was right, had slowly been replaced by a shadow, a stranger in his own skin. He had become the very embodiment of the anger he had clung to, and now, standing at the edge of his quest for retribution, Jalan realized that there was no victory to be had here. There was only the painful truth that he had become the monster he had once sworn to defeat. His hands shook as he lowered the weapon. There was no need for it anymore. In that moment, he understood that revenge, the very thing that had defined his existence for so long, would never bring him the peace he sought. It would only perpetuate the cycle of pain, taking him further away from the man he had once been, and further from the redemption he desperately needed. Jalan turned away, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like an iron anchor. As he walked away from the broken remnants of his past, he realized that the true battle was not against those who had betrayed him, but against the darkness that had consumed him. The vengeance he had sought had not healed him, it had only torn him apart. The faces of his enemies began to blur in his mind, no longer important. What mattered now was finding a way to rebuild himself, to find a sense of peace that could never be found in the destruction of others. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scars of his past would always remain with him. But as Jalan stepped into the unknown, the first glimmer of hope began to stir within him. It was faint, a fragile thing, but it was enough to guide him forward. He could not undo the years of pain, nor could he erase the betrayal that had shaped him. But he could choose to move forward, to let go of the anger that had defined him for so long. And in that choice, Jalan began to see the possibility of redemption, not through the destruction of his enemies, but through the healing of his own soul. The final moments of his journey were not filled with triumph, but with acceptance. Jalan had come to understand that the true victory was not in vengeance, but in the ability to forgive, not others, but himself. And as he continued his journey, step by step, he knew that the hardest part had just begun, learning to live with the consequences of his choices and, hopefully, finding a way to rebuild the man he had lost along the way.